You open your eyes, heart pounding, blood pressure spiking, your brain scrambling to figure out where you are. That sound, that jarring mechanical scream, just ripped you from sleep. Again, 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, for decades. And every single time it happens, something shifts inside your skull. Your hippocampus stutters, your prefrontal cortex lags behind. Your cardiovascular system floods with stress hormones before you even remember your own name. What if that alarm clock sitting on your nightstand is doing more than waking you up? What if it's rewiring your brain, one morning at a time? Every word you learned yesterday. During slow wave sleep, your brain generates oscillations between 0.5 and 4 hertz, massive coordinated waves that sweep across your cortex like tides. These slow oscillations trigger sleep spindles in your thalamus, bursts of activity lasting half a second to 2 seconds, oscillating at 10 to 15 hertz. And riding on top of those spindles, sharp wave ripples fire in your hippocampus at 150 to 250 hertz. This is memory consolidation. The hippocampus is talking to your neocortex, transferring what you learned from temporary storage to permanent files. Without this process, your brain can't learn, and an alarm clock interrupts it every single morning. If you value documented neuroscience and cardiovascular health research like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, the script is researched and factual, using sources from peer-reviewed journals, including a study published in Heart and Lung, Volume 68, in 2024 by Yeon-Soo Kim and colleagues at the University of Virginia School of Nursing, which measured beat-to-beat blood pressure changes during forced awakening, and research from the journal Hypertension in December 2024, examining cortisol awakening response patterns in brain network reconfigurations. We're also citing work from Sleep, Volume 47, Issue 9, September 2024, looking at how cortisol rhythms mediate sleep and circadian impacts on health. Now back to the information. Let's start with what happens in the seconds after your alarm goes off. Study conducted in 2024 at University of Virginia. 32 healthy adults. 2 nights in a sleep lab. First night, natural awakening. Second night, forced awakening after 5 hours of sleep. They wore smartwatches and finger blood pressure cuffs that measured beat-to-beat variability. The results. Forced awakening produced a morning blood pressure surge 74% higher than natural awakening. Not 74 points higher, 74%. The difference was 2.38 millimeters of mercury, but that surge activates your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, before you're even conscious. Your heart pumps harder, your vessels constrict. 1 in 3 Americans sleeps fewer than 7 hours per night. 1 in 3 Americans uses an alarm clock to wake up. And 1 in 3 Americans is at elevated risk for stroke and heart attack due to exaggerated morning blood pressure surges. They had electrodes in the hippocampus, orbitofrontal cortex, and thalamus. Researchers triggered arousals from sleep and measured what happened. First, the prefrontal cortex shows an early increase in low and fast activities during non-rapid eye movement sleep arousals. The hippocampus lags behind. Its spectral power during arousal sits intermediate between sleep and wakefulness, while the frontal cortex races ahead. This creates a temporal mismatch. Your prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, decision-making, working memory, is partially online, but your hippocampus, responsible for forming new memories, spatial navigation, emotional regulation, is still asleep. A study in consciousness and cognition in June 2021 found that when you wake up suddenly from early sleep stages, subcortical and sensoromotor structures activate first, followed by an ignition-like whole brain activation, with frontal regions engaging slightly after the rest of the brain. That delay matters. Subjective alertness recovered with a time constant of 0.67 hours, 40 minutes. Cognitive performance took longer. Time constant of 1.17 hours, 70 minutes. Tasks requiring complex cognition showed greater deficits than simple motor tasks. A study from University of Surrey published in PLOS 1 in November 2013 tested 11 participants on 4 types of cognitive tasks immediately after awakening, and at regular intervals for 4 hours. Alertness and sustained attention were more affected than cognitive throughput and working memory. Speed was more affected than accuracy. The brain regions associated with consciousness or arousal recover immediately, but areas associated with higher cognitive processes, prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, recover slowly. If you make a safety-critical decision within the first hour of waking, you're operating with impaired cognitive function, equivalent to being awake for 24 hours, or performing in the middle of the night. Then starting about 30 to 45 minutes before you wake up naturally, your cortisol begins rising. This is the cortisol awakening response, a 50% increase within the first 30 minutes after awakening. Study published in Psychoneuroendocrinology in 2011 showed that a stronger cortisol awakening response correlates with reduced heart rate variability, suggesting heightened morning stress activation negatively affects autonomic nervous system balance and cardiovascular regulation. But here's the critical finding from a PMC study published in 2016, examining 16 healthy males over 4 consecutive days and nights. Cortisol response differs between forced awakening during the day versus night. No difference in saliva cortisol between day alarm and day control conditions. But cortisol was significantly higher following night alarm and mobilization compared to night control condition. Magnitude of difference in cortisol between night control and night alarm was greater than between day control and day alarm. Heart rate was higher in both day and night alarm conditions compared to controls, but the cortisol spike during nocturnal forced awakening was augmented. When you force awakening during sleep, especially at night, you're triggering an exaggerated stress response. Cortisol awakening response proactively fosters emotional discrimination and working memory by modulating task-specific brain state occupancy and network dynamic reconfigurations. But this assumes natural awakening patterns. When you disrupt the natural cortisol rhythm with forced awakening, you decouple the timing. The mineralocorticoid receptor activation, which promotes neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, attention, vigilance, memory retrieval, and risk assessment, happens out of sync with your actual cognitive demands. A study in molecular psychiatry in December 2024 emphasized that optimal balance between mineralocorticoid and glucocorticoid receptor activation promotes resilience. Dysregulation leads to cognitive inflexibility, impaired stress handling, increased rumination, and hopelessness. Chronic alarm use doesn't just spike cortisol once. It trains your HPA axis to expect forced awakening, creating anticipatory stress even before the alarm sounds. Reactivate together. This reactivation occurs during sharp wave ripples, brief bursts of high-frequency oscillation in the hippocampus. Each ripple lasts 50 to 100 milliseconds. Inside that ripple, the hippocampus replays sequences of neuronal firing from waking experience, compressed into a faster timescale. These replays get transmitted to the neocortex via sleep spindles. The neocortex gradually builds permanent representations of the memory. After enough replay cycles, the memory becomes independent of the hippocampus. The hippocampal capacity refreshes, ready for new encoding the next day. Sleep apnea causes repeated arousals, brief awakenings lasting 3 to 15 seconds. Patients with an apnea-hypopnea index of 17.1 events per hour showed no differences in total sleep time, sleep efficiency, or sleep architecture compared to controls. No differences in sleepiness, no differences in psychomotor vigilance, no differences in initial learning. But when researchers tested overnight improvement on a motor sequence task, controls improved by 14.7%. Patients improved by 1.1%. The arousals from sleep interrupted memory consolidation. A study published in Nature Scientific Reports in October 2025 examined nap length and sleep inertia. Manual awakening after 9 minutes of stage 2 sleep improved subjective sleepiness and fatigue, but automatic awakening that allowed 19.6 minutes from stage 2 detection to alarm, long enough to potentially enter slow-wave sleep, produced no performance improvement. Participants showed more sleep inertia. Waking from slow-wave sleep disrupts the consolidation process. They just fragmented rapid eye movement and non-rapid eye movement sleep within the sleep bouts. Total sleep duration stayed the same. But the shortening of non-REM and REM sleep durations post-training impaired hippocampus-dependent fear memory consolidation. The hippocampus needs continuous bouts of slow-wave sleep above a minimum duration. Fragmentation, even without total sleep loss, disrupts consolidation. Study published in Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine showed that during slow-wave sleep, the hippocampus reactivates newly encoded information repeatedly, driven by slow oscillations originating in the neocortex. Synchronous spindle input at neocortical circuitry leads to long-term plastic changes through calcium influx into cortical pyramidal cell dendrites. This enhances expression of specific genes and receptors that support long-term potentiation. Over continuous cycles of sleep, connections gradually dissipate in the hippocampus, leaving it with refreshed encoding capacity, while connections within the neocortex build up. An alarm that interrupts this process leaves yesterday's memories incompletely consolidated, and today's hippocampus unprepared for new learning. Your cardiovascular system pays a price. Morning blood pressure surge is normal. Blood pressure drops during sleep, then rises when you wake. But exaggerated morning blood pressure surge is an independent risk factor for adverse cardiovascular events. A study published in American Heart Association journals found that morning blood pressure surge peaks on Monday, characterized by forced awakening after the weekend. Forced awakening is associated with shorter sleep duration, which further stimulates sympathetic tone and increases morning blood pressure surge. When morning blood pressure surge is excessive, it activates the sympathetic nervous system, producing the fight or flight response. The heart pumps harder and stronger. This causes fatigue, shortness of breath, anxiety, neck stiffness, and in acute cases, nosebleeds and headaches. Repeated excessive morning blood pressure surges contribute to long-term cardiovascular strain. Study, published in International Journal of Molecular Sciences in February 2025, examined how circadian disruption, like chronic forced awakening, alters cortisol secretion patterns, leading to dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which contributes to metabolic disorders, cardiovascular diseases, and impaired cognitive function. Even small increases in baseline blood pressure, like those produced by chronic exaggerated morning blood pressure surges, accumulate cardiovascular risk over time. Research published in European Heart Journal in 2024 notes that over 1.4 billion adults worldwide have hypertension, with the highest prevalence in low and middle-income countries. Hypertension control remains suboptimal globally, with fewer than 1 in 5 individuals achieving adequate blood pressure control. This gap contributes to significant public health burden, as hypertension is directly linked to increased risks of stroke, heart attack, heart failure, and chronic kidney disease. An alarm clock isn't just an inconvenience. For vulnerable populations, it's a daily cardiovascular stressor. Here's what happens over years. A study published in Neurology in November 2018 examined circulating cortisol and cognitive and structural brain measures in participants from the Framingham Heart Study. Higher cortisol levels were associated with lower total brain volume and worse performance on tests of visual perception, memory, and executive function. Research published in Stat Pearls in December 2025 explains that chronic elevation of cortisol, or dysregulation of the normal cortisol rhythm, can lead to cortisol excess disorders. Even without Cushing's syndrome, chronic stress, and repeated HPA, axis activation cause cumulative damage. The prefrontal cortex is particularly vulnerable. Study published in PLOS 1 in December 2025, examining patients with Cushing's syndrome and mild autonomous cortisol secretion, found significant sleep disturbances. Disrupted sleep patterns and abnormal cortisol rhythms create a vicious cycle. Poor sleep increases cortisol dysregulation. Cortisol dysregulation impairs sleep architecture. Both contribute to cognitive decline. Sleep inertia severity varies with factors including prior sleep loss, time of day when awakening occurs, and sleep stage at awakening. A study published in Journal of Sleep Research in 2019 found that sleep inertia is worse under conditions of prior sleep loss. Waking after acute or chronic sleep deprivation during circadian low or from deeper stages of sleep exacerbates sleep inertia. Performance impairment during sleep inertia can be equivalent to or greater than impairment after 40 hours of sleep deprivation. Evidence from multiple studies shows that sleep inertia effects appear on a range of tasks, from simple reaction time tests to complex cognitive tasks. While field studies of sleep inertia in real-world scenarios are lacking, evidence of sleep inertia in operational incidents has been demonstrated in several catastrophic events. Workers awakened from on-call sleep to respond to emergencies showed impaired decision-making during the first hour after awakening. Medical professionals, firefighters, emergency responders, military personnel, anyone required to perform safety-critical tasks soon after waking, operates under this cognitive handicap. A study published in Journal of Sleep Research in October 2023 examined predictors and effects of snoozing. First study surveyed students. Second study compared effects of using versus not using a snooze alarm on sleep inertia immediately after awakening from normal nocturnal sleep. Although snoozing showed small positive effects on cognitive performance for arithmetic speed, episodic memory, and cognitive cost in the Stroop task, only episodic memory showed an interaction effect between time awake and condition. This suggests snoozing improves performance for the entire 40-minute test period, but effects likely wear off over time awake. Main benefit of snoozing may be reduction of inertia directly upon waking. However, a study published in PMC in December 2022 examined effects of snooze alarms in Japanese university students. Participants set snooze alarms allowing 4 or 5 resets in the last 20 minutes of nocturnal sleep, separated by 5-minute intervals. Wake time and stage 1 sleep were prolonged after the first snooze alarm in the last 20 minutes. Auditory reaction times were slower in session 3, and global vigor deteriorated after awakening in the snooze alarm condition compared to no snooze condition. Snoozing fragments the last critical period of sleep. Each snooze cycle triggers another awakening, another blood pressure surge, another disruption to ongoing consolidation processes. These mice showed disrupted non-REM sleep and impaired sleep-related spatial memory consolidation. The lack of adult neurogenesis led to changes in sleep architecture and oscillations that represent the dialogue between hippocampus and neocortex during sleep. Adult neurogenesis, as a key event of hippocampal plasticity, plays an important role for sleep-dependent memory consolidation and modulates learning-induced changes of sleep macro and microstructure. Research published in PMC in 2013 showed that sleep deprivation disrupts long-term potentiation in the hippocampus. Study examined area CA1 after 12 hours of total sleep deprivation and found that the procedure inhibited induction of LTP. Follow-up studies demonstrated that LTP is vulnerable to total sleep deprivation, REM-specific sleep deprivation, and fragmented sleep. Multiple mechanisms explain how sleep deprivation disrupts memory consolidation. Modulation of glutamatergic signaling through alterations in NMDA and AMPA receptor subunit composition, elevation of extracellular adenosine, which enhances inhibitory tone in the hippocampus, elevation of phosphodiesterase 4A, which perturbs CAMP intracellular signaling, decreased transcription of plasticity-related genes, and downregulation of mammalian target. Of rapamycin signaling, a key regulator of protein synthesis required for memory consolidation. If you learn something important during the day, then get woken by an alarm after 5 hours of sleep, you're interrupting consolidation during the critical window. And if this happens chronically, 5 days a week for years, you're chronically impairing your brain's ability to form long-term memories. A study published in Frontiers in Psychology in July 2019 examined the interaction of REM fragmentation and nighttime arousal on sleep-dependent emotional memory consolidation. Fragmentation of REM sleep predicted poor neutral declarative memory consolidation in participants with post-traumatic stress disorder. The sleep to forget, sleep to remember hypothesis states that the neurobiological environment provided by REM-rich sleep decouples emotional tone from memory content. Fragmentation disrupts this process. Your brain needs continuous, uninterrupted sleep cycles to properly process and store memories. A study in 2024 found that people who woke up to harsh alarm tones like sirens or radar had higher heart rates compared to those who awoke to soothing sounds like ocean waves or birdsong. The amplitude and frequency characteristics of the alarm matter. A loud, jarring sound triggers a more aggressive sympathetic response than a gradually increasing gentle tone. But even with melodic alarms, forced awakening still produces blood pressure surges and sleep inertia. The fundamental issue isn't the alarm sound, it's the forced transition from sleep to wakefulness before your brain and body are ready. The locus coeruleus increases norepinephrine release. The RAFO nuclei increase serotonin. The basal forebrain increases acetylcholine. These neurotransmitter systems gradually shift the brain from sleep to wakefulness. Cortisol rises in anticipation. The transition happens smoothly. By contrast, forced awakening with an alarm overrides these natural processes. The sudden auditory stimulus activates the ascending reticular activating system in the brainstem, which sends widespread projections to thalamus and cortex. This creates a rapid, forced state change. The thalamus and sensory cortices come online quickly, but the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and other higher-order structures lag behind. This mismatch creates the cognitive impairment of sleep inertia. And the sudden activation of the sympathetic nervous system creates the exaggerated cardiovascular response. Dawn simulation devices gradually increase light intensity over 30 minutes before wake time. Some studies show this reduces sleep inertia complaints, though the mechanism isn't entirely clear. The gradual light exposure may help align circadian phase or may provide a gentler cue for awakening than sudden sound. Temperature changes also matter. A study published in PMC in 2024 examined a multimodal bedroom-based smart alarm system that manipulated ambient temperature, lighting, and sound. The intervention began 45 minutes before scheduled wake time with gradual increase in ambient temperature by 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Rest of intervention triggered when sleep sensor detected 5-minute bout of light sleep. Results showed mixed findings. Participant chronotype and length of lighting exposure influenced sleep inertia symptoms. Moderate evening types who received shorter lighting exposure showed more lapses relative to control condition. The research on alternative awakening methods is still developing, but the pattern is clear. Gentler, gradual transitions reduce the negative impacts compared to sudden forced awakening and circadian impacts on health. Multicellular organisms developed timing systems, cellular clocks, to synchronize external nutrient cycles with internal cycles, including energetic processes controlling metabolism, restorative activities including sleep, and reproductive programs. In mammals, cellular clocks and peripheral organs are coordinated through hormonal and neural signals orchestrated by the central circadian pacemaker located in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. Endogenous hormonal signals exhibit 24-hour rhythms in the blood that are recognizable in the absence of external cycles of light-dark, wake-sleep, feeding-fasting, and activity-rest. When you force awakening with an alarm, you create a mismatch between your endogenous circadian rhythm and your behavioral schedule. This circadian misalignment has metabolic consequences. Studies show that circadian disruption through night shift work or forced desynchrony contributes to increased risk of obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease. Ambulatory blood pressure monitoring systems that measure blood pressure continuously provide information on how patient blood pressure variations connect to daily activities and sleep patterns. If chronic alarm use contributes to exaggerated morning blood pressure surges, and those surges accumulate cardiovascular strain over years, the long-term impact could be substantial. Research published in Hypertension in January 2025 estimated national impact of the 2025 American Heart Association and American College of Cardiology high blood pressure guideline changes. The new guideline recommends using the PREVENT equations to guide treatment decisions and recommends antihypertensive therapy for adults with stage 1 hypertension and low predicted cardiovascular disease risk if blood pressure remains elevated after 3 to 6 months of lifestyle intervention. This expands the population recommended for treatment. Part of lifestyle intervention should include addressing sleep quality and awakening patterns. If alarm clock use contributes to blood pressure dysregulation, it's a modifiable risk factor. Study, published in November 2025 in Neuropsychologia, examined whether sleep-associated memory consolidation paves the way for next-day learning by freeing up hippocampal encoding resources. According to the active systems consolidation model, memory representations, initially reliant on the hippocampus, are redistributed to neocortex during sleep for long-term storage. An indirect assumption is that sleep-associated memory processing frees up hippocampal encoding resources. Research shows that sleep-associated memory consolidation reduces hippocampal engagement during retrieval, and this reduction in hippocampal burden may enhance the brain's capacity for new learning. But this process requires adequate, uninterrupted sleep. Chronic alarm use that fragments sleep and disrupts consolidation could impair not just memory retention, but also learning capacity. Co-replays in humans using fMRI. 36 young adults completed an image and location-paired associate encoding task. Researchers identified post-encoding rest periods that showed neural reactivation of each image location trial in both hippocampus and category-selective cortex. Interestingly, awake hippocampal cortical co-reactivation was associated with forgetting, not better memory. The interpretation? Coexisting hippocampal and cortical representations might reflect cross-regional interactions that lead to integration of related events, and this integration itself may disrupt subsequent representation of event-specific encoding patterns. This aligns with trace transformation theories of consolidation, which propose that memories undergo reorganization during consolidation, becoming more generalized variants, retaining gist, but losing details and context specificity. The consolidation process that happens during sleep is different from waking reactivation. Sleep provides the specific neurobiological environment, the pattern of oscillations, the neurochemical milieu, the absence of external interference that allows for proper consolidation without interference. Modified cortisol circadian rhythm as the hidden toll of night shift work. Night shift work alters the natural secretion pattern of cortisol, leading to dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which contributes to metabolic disorders, cardiovascular diseases, and impaired cognitive function. The same mechanisms apply to chronic alarm use. Even if you're not doing shift work, if you're using an alarm clock to force awakening 5 to 7 days per week, you're creating a form of circadian disruption. Your endogenous circadian system is trying to time your awakening based on internal signals. The alarm overrides those signals. This creates a disconnect between your circadian phase and your behavioral schedule. Over time, this disconnect has physiological consequences. The prefrontal cortex is particularly vulnerable to sleep disruption. Research shows that the medial prefrontal cortex is implicated in generation of slow-wave sleep, and prefrontal atrophy has been linked to decreases in slow-wave sleep. Prefrontal atrophy occurs naturally as individuals age, and older adults experience impairments in memory consolidation as their medial prefrontal cortices degrade. In older adults, instead of being transferred and stored in neocortex during slow-wave sleep, memories start to remain in the hippocampus where they were encoded. This is evidenced by increased hippocampal activation compared to younger adults during recall tasks. Anything that further degrades slow-wave sleep quality, including chronic forced awakening, could accelerate this age-related decline. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive function, planning, decision-making, working memory, personality expression, moderating social behavior, controlling aspects of speech and language. Executive function includes ability to differentiate among conflicting thoughts, determine good and bad, better and best, same and different, future consequences of current activities, working toward defined goals, prediction of outcomes, expectation based on actions, and social control. Chronic impairment of prefrontal function through disrupted sleep and repeated stress responses has cascading effects on quality of life. Quantitatively, this decrease has been estimated at around 40% during slow-wave sleep compared to wakefulness. Regionally, reductions of brain activity were located in subcortical structures, including brainstem, thalamus, basal ganglia, basal forebrain, and cortical regions including prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, and precuneus. These brain structures include neuronal populations involved in arousal and awakening, as well as areas which are among the most active during wakefulness. During REM sleep, quantification of brain glucose metabolism shows global level of activity not significantly different from wakefulness, but several brain structures enhance their activity during REM sleep compared to waking. These include pontine tegmentum, thalamus, basal forebrain, amygdala, hippocampus, anterior cingulate cortex, and temporooccipital areas, while dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate gyrus, precuneus, and inferior parietal cortex decrease. This segregated activity is in agreement with REM sleep generation mechanisms in animals, which involve cholinergic processes arising from brainstem structures and activating cortex via thalamus and basal forebrain. The findings suggest that hippocampus and prefrontal arousals and awakenings are progressive phenomena. Pattern of activity could underlie link between sleep stage, arousal and awakening duration, and restoration of memory abilities, including dream recall. When you force awakening with an alarm, you bypass the natural progressive transition. The brain systems don't have time to coordinate their state changes. This creates the temporal mismatch where some systems are online while others lag behind. But there's a need for further research into reactive countermeasures that can be deployed in operational scenarios. Light exposure, particularly blue-enhanced white light, has been investigated. A study found that alertness and all cognitive processes were impaired immediately upon awakening. However, alertness and sustained attention were more affected than cognitive throughput and working memory. Light conditions had no differential effect on performance except in the 3-back task, where response times at end of 4 hours in 2 blue-enhanced white light conditions were faster than at wake time. The spectral and intensity response to light is different from that of sleepiness. Just increasing blue wavelength in light may not be sufficient to reduce sleep inertia. The fundamental solution isn't finding better countermeasures for forced awakening. The solution is avoiding forced awakening when possible. Most people using alarm clocks don't realize they're creating daily stress on their cardiovascular system and disrupting their memory consolidation. Second, prioritize sleep duration. If you need to wake at 7 a.m., that dictates when you must fall asleep to get 7 to 8 hours. Calculate backwards. Protect that bedtime. Third, consider alarm sound selection. While even melodic alarms involve forced awakening, gentler sounds produce smaller cardiovascular spikes than harsh tones. Fourth, if your schedule allows, try going to bed 30 minutes earlier and waking without alarm on weekends to observe your natural wake time. This gives you baseline data about your circadian phase. Fifth, address sleep quality. Sleep fragmentation amplifies the negative effects of forced awakening. Optimize your sleep environment: temperature, darkness, noise control, comfortable mattress. Sixth, consider whether you truly need an alarm every day. Many people use alarms habitually without testing whether they still need them. If you're getting adequate sleep, you might wake naturally at the right time. Seventh, if you have cardiovascular disease or are at elevated risk, discuss awakening patterns with your physician. Morning blood pressure surge is a modifiable risk factor. The challenge is that optimal sleep stage for awakening varies by individual and circumstance. Waking from REM sleep may preserve dream recall, but produce different physiological response than waking from stage 2 non-REM sleep. The goal should be completing full sleep cycles when possible. A typical sleep cycle lasts 90 to 110 minutes. If you can time your sleep duration to align with complete cycles, 7.5 hours instead of 7 hours, or 6 hours instead of 6.5 hours, you increase likelihood of waking between cycles rather than mid-cycle. But individual variation is substantial. Some people have shorter cycles, some have longer cycles. Cycle length changes across the night. The only reliable way to know your patterns is through polysomnography or high-quality actigraphy over multiple nights. Impaired memory consolidation reduces cognitive performance, which creates more stress, which further disrupts sleep. Breaking this cycle requires addressing multiple factors simultaneously. You can't fix sleep quality without addressing awakening patterns. You can't address awakening patterns without adjusting schedules and priorities. You can't adjust schedules without acknowledging that sleep is not optional or dispensable. It's a biological necessity. The brain requires sleep to function. Forcing awakening before the brain is ready creates measurable, documented impairments that persist for hours after waking and accumulate damage over years. Rates of cognitive impairment and dementia are increasing as population ages. Obesity and metabolic disease are epidemic. All of these conditions have documented connections to sleep quality and circadian disruption. If chronic alarm use contributes even modestly to these outcomes, the population-level impact is enormous. Healthcare systems spend billions treating conditions that might be partially preventable through better sleep. Productivity losses from cognitive impairment during the first hours of the day cost economies billions more. Traffic accidents during morning commutes, workplace errors during morning shifts, medical mistakes during morning procedures. How many of these trace back to sleep inertia from forced awakening? blood pressure, circadian rhythms, sleep architecture, and memory consolidation. International organizations, including American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, European Society of Cardiology, and Japanese Society of Hypertension, are updating guidelines to incorporate new evidence. The focus is shifting from simply treating disease to preventing it through lifestyle modification. Sleep is a lifestyle factor. Awakening pattern is a lifestyle factor. Both are modifiable. Both have measurable impacts on health outcomes. The challenge is translating research findings into behavior change at population scale. People know they should exercise more, eat better, and reduce stress. Now add wake up naturally to the list, but unlike other lifestyle changes, this one conflicts directly with societal demands and work schedules. Some companies are experimenting with flexible start times. Some schools are starting later for adolescents, recognizing that teenage circadian phase is delayed compared to adults. These changes face institutional resistance and logistical challenges, but the evidence supporting them continues accumulating. Research published in 2024 showed that early school start times misalign with adolescent circadian phase, leading to chronic sleep deprivation, impaired academic performance, increased risk of depression and anxiety, and elevated accident rates. Moving school start times later by even 30 minutes produces measurable improvements in attendance, grades, and mental health. The same principle applies to adults. Forced early awakening for work or other obligations creates circadian misalignment. The misalignment has costs. Society pays those costs through healthcare expenses, reduced productivity, and degraded quality of life. It creates cognitive impairment that lasts for over an hour. And it does all this 5 to 7 days per week for decades. The accumulated impact, measured in cardiovascular strain, impaired memory formation, disrupted circadian rhythms, and chronic stress activation, is substantial. The research is clear. The mechanisms are documented. The question is what you do with this information. The final piece, a study published in Journal of Hypertension in 2024 examined daytime sensitivity and how it predicts nocturnal dipping patterns and morning surge in blood pressure. Researchers used the home activity ICT-based Japan ambulatory blood pressure monitoring prospective study. They found that patterns of physical activity during the day correlate with blood pressure patterns during sleep and upon awakening. This suggests that the morning blood pressure surge isn't just about the awakening itself, it's about the overall pattern of autonomic nervous system activity across the 24-hour cycle. Chronic forced awakening doesn't just affect that moment, it resets the baseline. It trains your cardiovascular system and stress systems to expect and prepare for forced awakening. This anticipatory response may be protective in some sense. Better to have cortisol rising before the alarm than to be caught completely off guard. But it also means your body never fully relaxes. You sleep with one eye open, metabolically speaking. That vigilance has a cost. From patients with epilepsy, they measured hippocampal and prefrontal cortex activity during arousing reactions from sleep. The finding: awakening from sleep is a progressive and dynamic process. The hippocampus transitions slowly. The prefrontal cortex shows early activation during non-REM sleep arousals, but that activation depends on sleep stage and intensity of the arousing stimulus. The pattern of activity underlines restoration of memory abilities. An alarm doesn't respect this process. It forces the transition. It overrides the natural progression. And your hippocampus pays the price. 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year. For how many years? That's not a rhetorical question, it's a calculation. Take your age when you started using an alarm clock regularly, subtract from your current age, multiply by 260 days. That's how many mornings you forced your brain to wake before it was ready. Now measure the cost.